In HBR Talk 27, Boundary Issues, Feminism versus Civic Accountability, we discuss the concepts of human and civil rights as follows. Human rights considerations define the nature and boundaries of individual human autonomy within society. The most basic iteration of this is the adage, "Your rights end where my nose begins." Civil rights considerations define the boundaries between citizen autonomy and authority and the government's combined responsibility and authority. They are the limitations which protect citizens from oppression at the hands of government entities which would abuse authority. In other words, we pointed out that your civil rights protections are your legal shield against government-imposed human rights violations. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. We were responding to a Women's March talking point that designated those to be women's issues, and the discussion centered around the fact that these rights cannot be divided by gender, and the fact that, historically, their defense was achieved mostly at the cost of men's work, men's blood, and men's deaths. Human and civil rights are genderless in nature, and should be respected as such, but the fight for them has always been a men's issue. That makes Joe Biden's April 8th remarks on gun control and the Second Amendment also a men's issue, whether or not gun control itself may be considered one, and regardless of whether we are united or divided on that issue. Biden said, "But no amendment to the Constitution is absolute. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater and call it freedom of speech. From the very beginning, you couldn't own any weapon you wanted to own. From the very beginning that the Second Amendment existed, certain people weren't allowed to have weapons. So the idea is just bizarre to suggest that some of the things we're recommending are contrary to the Constitution." Biden's Second Amendment statement is yet another incarnation of one he made in a campaign speech last year, a claim for which there is no evidence, as PolitiFact said in an article fact-checking that speech. In the recent version, the statement was rewritten to make it more vague in the hopes that it wouldn't be debunked again, but in its vagueness, it has become useless. Constitutional protection of civil rights is reliant on citizenship. It's reasonable to say that non-citizens' gun rights weren't protected, but can Mr. Biden cite an 18th or 19th century United States federal law that imposed upon U.S. citizens the limitations he described? No, actually. Not honestly, anyway. He might say one existed, just as he stated that you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, but he'd be wrong about both. As Trevor Timm explained in a 2012 article for The Atlantic, the fire in a crowded theater standard is a myth based on an analogy made by Oliver Wendell Holmes during a controversial 1919 Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Schenck, which became irrelevant after the court's ruling on Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, effectively, as Tim writes, overturning Schenck and any authority the case still carried. That was over half a century ago, and politicians like Joe Biden continue to promote the myth because it suits them, just as it suits him to lie about the history of U.S. federal gun control legislation, which did not even exist until the 20th century. That old Mr. Biden, the career politician, lied again is not the most disturbing thing about that statement, however. The most disturbing thing was some inadvertent honesty behind the line about no amendment being absolute. To understand that, you have to know a bit more about Schenck versus the U.S. That case was about whether the Espionage Act of 1917 could be applied to the activities of a man who was handing out pamphlets which, without advocating any violence or even civil disobedience, urged his fellow citizens to assert their rights in protest against the draft enacted for World War I through, wait for it, communicating their concerns to legislators by signing a petition for its repeal. Biden followed up his claim that no amendment is absolute by citing the myth stemming from that case and lying about gun legislation history, specifically in an attempt at acclimating the audience to the idea of limits on constitutional civil rights protections. Underneath that blustering facade, he was telling you something much more nefarious. As I explained earlier, civil rights considerations are the legal boundaries of your personhood, your legal shield against government-imposed human rights violations. On April 8th, 2021, Joe Biden informed the American public that he, as the executive officer of the U.S. federal government, determines the validity and extent of your civil boundaries, likely even their existence. By virtue of his own approval of the beliefs he espouses, he just inconspicuously coronated himself the King of the United States of America, with the ultimate power to decide whether or not you, the citizen, may even be said to have rights. As I pointed out in the HBR Talk 27 opener, your civil rights were not defined and described by the founding fathers of the United States of America for the purpose of making the U.S. federal government the arbiter and therefore limiter of those rights. It was not to enact government provision of your rights, but to protect you from government infringement on your personal autonomy in violation of your rights. The upshot is, civil rights protections laid out in the Constitution are not subject to executive approval. They are there to communicate and preserve the right and responsibility of citizens to keep their government in check as a means of preventing the slow decay of our representative republic into a despotic nightmare. How do we do that if no amendment to our Constitution, the instruction manual for our government's relationship to its citizens, is absolute? What can we do? Go stand before the desk of King Joe and beseech him, "Please, sir, I want some more respect for my human rights." How many of your rights are now subject to King Joe's approval? Given that this administration has embraced the racist, classist, and sexist progressive concept of equity as a replacement for equality, how long before the Biden policy on citizens' rights will be applied to the 14th Amendment, effectively eliminating your protection against unequal treatment under the law? Can you sue for redress against gender-based discrimination in family court if King Joe is not the defender, but the arbiter of your civil rights? How about asserting your Fifth Amendment right to due process in criminal court? Will King Joe, the guy who wrote the two biggest legislative attacks on that civil right during the 20th century, permit you to exercise it? You know, his crime bill didn't just attack your due process rights in regard to imprisonment. Due process is involved in disputes with the government over your property, too. If you're still protected by the rights laid out in the Constitution, it can't just be confiscated without a hearing. But how long will that stand under the rulership of old King Joe? Understand this. The amendments to the U.S. Constitution are, by virtue of having been ratified, part of the Constitution. By declaring the amendments not absolute, old King Joe has essentially declared the Constitution itself subject to the approval of those whose powers are supposed to be laid out within and limited by it. And if the Constitution, the foundation for our system of law, is not absolute, then neither is our federal law. That, too, is subject to the whims of our new king. It should be very easy to understand why the assertion contained within his seemingly incompetent blustering is so dangerous. And it's not just dangerous to U.S. citizens. The temptation among non-U.S. listeners might be to gloat about the fall of the United States. But take a moment before you do. Think about how far King Joe's power grab can be carried, considering we are talking about an old warmonger who hates borders. Those of you who feel that previous administrations have been too quick to use military force against foreign countries or drone strikes against individual targets, imagine how much more a geriatric militarist with nothing to lose could do if the limitations on his war powers are not absolute. Are you nervous yet, comrade? Have you had enough? This week, HBR Talk will be discussing the importance of civil rights considerations to men's issues initiatives, such as efforts at getting equally shared parenting legislation passed, the National Coalition for Men's lawsuit against the male-only selective service system, and public opposition to foreign warmongering among U.S. leadership. You can tune in to the live stream via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options on HoneyBadgerBrigade.com. In addition to that, please help us to severely and irreparably trigger the United States Thought Police by liking and sharing this video.